My son was standing in my kitchen doorway holding a bank statement he had found in a drawer that was not his. $63,000. A consolidation loan in his name alone originated 19 months earlier, and he had never seen the full terms. He read the number once and then again. The way a man reads a sentence he is trying to make say something different. 9 weeks before that morning, his wife had called to inform me her parents would be moving into the cottage behind my property before Christmas. She did not ask, she informed. And I said no. That is where everything started. My name is Henry Ward. I am 67 years old. I live in Cedar Bluff, Virginia, though I spent most of my life in the central part of the state where the rivers run wide and the bridges over them need looking after. That was my work. 34 years as a bridge inspector for the state. I carried a certification number the way a doctor carries a license. It went on every report I signed, and every report was a statement under oath that the structure was safe for the public to cross or that it was not. There was no middle. You do not get to feel like a bridge is sound. You measure it. You document the measurement. You compare it to the standard. If your number and the standard do not agree, you shut it down, and it does not matter who is inconvenienced. My father was a carpenter in Lynchburg. He told me something when I was 14 that I did not understand for 20 years. He said, a joint that looks tight is not the same as a joint that is tight. You check. You always check. I have thought about that sentence more in the last 2 years than in the previous 40. Here is what that job puts in a man, and it is the only qualification I have for telling you this story. You do not sign your name to something because it looks all right. You sign it because you have verified it is right and you can prove it. And if you sign and something gives way and a car goes into a river, that is yours forever. So you inspect, you check the actual reading against the actual standard. You do not go on feel. I retired at 64 with a state pension and a savings I had been building since 1989. I also had a picture in my head I had been carrying since about 2001. 9 acres somewhere quiet with a shop where I could finally set up the woodworking tools I had been paying to store in a unit outside Richmond for 9 years. Do the math on 9 years of storage fees. I have. I looked at property in 3 states over 8 months. I found the place in Cedar Bluff on my 3rd trip out, 11 acres. A 1926 farmhouse added onto twice by people who valued function over beauty. A cottage past the tree line that had been used as a guest house for decades, and a shop. That shop was the reason. 30 by 40, concrete floor, 14-foot ceiling, and a 220 line already wired. I closed in September. Drove out afterward and parked in the grass and shut the engine off and sat with the windows down for 30 minutes. The air smelled like hay and warm clay, and the creek at the back of the property made a sound you could hear if you held still. It was late September. The oaks had not started turning yet. They go copper in October, and the light comes through them in a way that makes everything feel like a photograph you have already taken. I did not know that about Virginia oaks until I lived among them. There was a red-tailed hawk working the field. 64 years old, and I had never in my life been that sure of anything. I called my son that evening from the porch. The light was going copper through the trees, and Dutch, my yellow lab, lay on the boards beside me chewing a stick he had found somewhere important. My son's name is Daniel. He was 36 then. He teaches history at a high school in Roanoke and coaches the junior varsity track team. He is the kind of man who drives 40 minutes to help a neighbor move without mentioning it afterward. His mother made him that way. I take no credit. Margaret died when Daniel was 22, cancer. It started in her lungs and moved the way cancer moves, slowly enough to let you hope, fast enough to prove you wrong. 14 months. She was 51, and she was the wiser half of us, and she knew it, and she was patient about it. She had a phrase. She used it about our marriage when we argued, about my stubbornness, about a neighbor who kept patching a roof that needed replacing. You cannot repair what you refuse to inspect. I heard it so often I stopped hearing it. Then she was gone and the house was quiet, and I started hearing it again in every room, making coffee for one, talking to an empty room and then catching yourself, reaching across an empty bed at 3 in the morning and finding nothing and lying there remembering that you already knew. That first year I left her mug in the dish rack for 6 months before I moved it. I do not know why I am telling you that, except that it is the truest thing I know about grief. It is not the big moments. It is the mug. Daniel brought his wife Sarah the second time he visited. She came up the steps the way she did most things, efficiently, looked at the fields, and said it was beautiful. Then she said it was a lot of land for one person. I let that sit. It was not a question. I had no idea at the time how much that single sentence would come to mean. It was the first measurement that did not match the chart. Sarah was 34. She worked in medical billing. She was organized and direct in a way I initially respected. She could manage a room, a schedule, a conversation. She could manage Daniel, and he did not always notice, which is how it works when the managing is done with enough warmth to pass for partnership. I tried to like her. I want to be clear about that. I wanted my son happy. Her parents were Richard and Grace Hale. Richard was 61, a man perpetually on the verge of something successful. Every conversation included a venture about to turn a corner. Grace was quieter. She organized outcomes from a distance, the way certain people do, not visibly. But if you watched long enough, things tended to arrive pre-shaped in ways that served their household. If this story is already pulling at something in you, I hope you will stay with me. Subscribe to this channel so stories like this keep reaching the people who need to hear them. The first time I noticed something wrong was Thanksgiving, 2 years after I moved. Sarah called 4 days before. She told me what time to arrive, what to bring, where I would sit. I said I had planned to bring the sweet potatoes I always made, Margaret's recipe, the one Daniel asked for every year. She said the menu was set. I brought them anyway. Nobody touched them. Daniel looked at them once, and then looked at Sarah, and then looked somewhere else. My chest tightened, not because of sweet potatoes, because my son had checked with his wife before he reached for a dish his mother used to make, and what I saw in that glance was not partnership, it was calculation. He was measuring the cost. That is a thing you learn to see after 3 decades of comparing what is visible against what is true. A bridge carries traffic for years while the substructure corrodes underneath. In January, Sarah mentioned my pension amount to a friend at a gathering. She said it casually with my name and a number close enough to be accurate. She was 6 feet from me. She did not lower her voice. Something behind my ribs went very still. That was not hers to share. In March, I drove to Roanoke for a weekend Daniel and I had planned 3 weeks earlier. Sarah met me at the door. Daniel had a work obligation. He would not be available until Saturday afternoon. She offered me coffee with the right face. I drove home. None of us knew what the next several months would bring. That night, Daniel called, sounding rehearsed. He was sorry. I said it was fine. It was not fine. There was a thing Daniel's voice did when Sarah's name came up on the phone. Just a small flattening, a slight adjustment, like a man shifting his weight on a chair with one short leg. I had been hearing it for about 1.5 years. I never said a word about it. That is what men my age always say. It is not ours to say. What we mean is that saying it costs something. In April, at Easter dinner, I found Daniel in the kitchen alone drying dishes. I asked him what Richard did for a living. He kept drying. He said Richard was between things. He said it the way you say something you have stopped believing but not stopped saying. I dried a plate and handed it to him, and we stood there together in that kitchen, and the silence held everything the words could not. And now I need to tell you about the one time Sarah was not any of these things. In 2019, before I moved, I fell off a ladder cleaning gutters and cracked 2 ribs. Daniel was in the middle of exams. Sarah drove 3 hours that same evening with soup and a blanket and a book. She stayed on my couch, checked on me twice in the night, and drove home without ever making it a thing. Not once in 7 years did she mention it. That woman existed. The distance between exhausted and dishonest is shorter than anyone admits. The call came on a Sunday in October. I was putting the second coat of tung oil on a cherry cabinet I had been building for 3 weeks. The shop smelled like oil and wood shavings, and the light through the windows was the color it gets in early Virginia fall when the air has a sharpness that was not there the week before. Sarah has a particular voice for when she is executing something efficient, slightly impatient. Like the conversation is a line item on a list she is already checking off. Her parents' lease was up. The market was impossible. And then without a pause, you have that cottage sitting empty. The obvious thing is they use it while they get sorted. I said, Sarah, that cottage has been empty 3 years. She said, my parents need somewhere and you have a whole building nobody is using. This is what family does. I had heard that sentence before. Every time it meant the same thing. I was about to supply something I had not been asked about. I said, have you talked to Daniel? Daniel agrees, family comes first. That is not an answer. I caught it after 4 seconds. A sentence built to sound like agreement without being one. I said I would talk to him myself. Her voice dropped half a degree. If you cannot help family when they need it, that says something about you. And honestly, Henry, if 11 acres is more than you can manage at your age, maybe the real conversation is about whether you should be out there alone. I was 66 years old. I walked 4 miles daily on a gravel road with a grade. I was cutting dovetails by hand. I had spent 34 years deciding whether bridges were safe for the public, and she was suggesting I was not competent to live on my own property. I said goodnight and hung up. And that decision, the decision to say goodnight instead of saying yes, would turn out to be the most important one I have ever made. I felt no anger. I became the way I used to become when a gauge read wrong, not upset, attentive. Something was off in this structure, and I had the first indicator. Before I continue, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what city you are watching from and what time it is. I spent 34 years on bridges people crossed without a thought. Someone listening to this at midnight in a kitchen somewhere feels like being seen in a way I am not used to. I read every comment, and I mean that. Daniel called next morning, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Dad, I am sorry. She should not have come at you like that. Her folks really are in trouble. Richard is between things, and their landlord is selling. She told me you agreed. A pause. I said it could work if you were all right with it, but you did not call me yourself. And my son said, no, I should have. I hung up and made coffee and sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad, not to vent, to lay it out, what I know, what I do not know, what I need to find out. Same format I used on 500 inspection reports, because this was not about the cottage. The cottage was the crack in the concrete that makes you pull the panel and look at the rebar. 3 years of small things. Sarah assigning me arrival times at my son's holidays. Sarah sharing my finances with strangers. Sarah canceling my visits through accomplished facts. None of those alone sounds like anything. That is the design. Nobody moves a boundary by a foot. They move it an inch 50 times, and then someone is assigning your outbuilding. First call was to Eleanor Cross, property attorney in Cedar Bluff, office above a feed store. About 60. The kind of woman who listens without expression and then says exactly what you did not want to hear. She said, your land, your decision, no ambiguity. If they show up after you have said no, that is trespass. What is really bothering you? I said, I have sat across a table from Richard Hale for 6 years and I still cannot tell you what the man does. I have asked Daniel twice. Both times he changed the subject. She gave me a name. Second call was to my insurance agent. Unauthorized occupants in a secondary structure is a real coverage problem. He walked me through the liability. Third call was to Daniel. Not about the cottage, just to talk. 40 minutes. His students. A book he wanted me to read. At the end he said, I miss just talking to you. I said, same. That call was the only clean thing in 12 months. The investigator was Arthur Crane, 70 years old. Office, spent a hardware store in Wytheville, $500, 2 individuals, 10 days. The report came Thursday in a plain envelope, 11 pages. Richard Hale, 61. A landscaping company folded in 2015 owing suppliers. A pressure washing outfit ended in 2018 with a judgment for unpaid subs. A cleaning service in Grace's name dissolved 7 months before I read the report. A lien on their vehicle. A judgment from a former partner, $58,000, 2 years old and unpaid. I read it twice. Then something surfaced from Easter. Daniel mentioning he and Sarah were saving for a house. 2.5 more years. A specific number for the down payment. I called Arthur Monday. I need you to look deeper. I want to know whether their problems have been getting solved through my son. He said he could pull public records, court filings, recorded judgments. I said, do it. What came back 12 days later changed everything. I read the second report on my porch on a Saturday in November with the trees bare and the mountains gray. A consolidation loan in Daniel's name alone, $63,000. I set the page on my knee. A hawk crossed the field low and banked into the tree line. Dutch lifted his head and put it back down. The cottage was not the story. The cottage was the hairline crack in the deck plate that makes you pull the inspection cover and find what has been happening inside for 2 years. I do not know how another man handles that afternoon. Some drive to Roanoke. Some call their sons screaming. I sat on my porch for 2 hours watching the light change across the field. Then I went into the shop and sanded something because my hands needed work my mind could not do. The sawdust smelled like pine. The mountains were right there through the open door, and Margaret's voice was in the room with me. You cannot repair what you refuse to inspect. I had not repaired anything, but I had inspected, and what I found was exactly what I had spent 3 years trying not to see. Daniel came out on a Friday 3 weeks later, alone. Sarah had not come up in the phone call, and I had not asked. He looked wrong. Thinner than he ought to have been. A tightness around his eyes I recognized because I wore that face myself for 4 years after Margaret's diagnosis. We worked in the shop. I showed him the cabinet. He ran his hand across the top and said it was the finest thing he had touched, and he said it without looking up, which is how you know. We grilled that evening. Sat on the porch until the cold drove us in. He said, "She told me to come convince you." I said, "I know. I do not want to. I know that too." He looked at the mountains. "Dad, how did I get here?" "You love someone. You trusted her. Neither is a failing." Then I said, "There is something I have to show you, and it will be a bad night, and I'm going to show it anyway." Now, I need to slow this down because this is the part that matters, and every version of this story I have ever heard rushes past it. I went inside and got the folder. Manila, but 1/2 inch thick. The whole thing built since October. I came back out and sat down next to him on the porch steps. I did not hand it to him. That was deliberate. I set it on the step between us, and I let him be the one to pick it up. He picked it up. I looked at the field and listened to the creek and let my son read. It took a long time. He got through the first pages at a normal pace. Then he slowed. He went back a page. He read the dissolved cleaning business twice. Then the last section, he stopped moving entirely. $63,000. Flat. And then again, testing it. $63,000. I said nothing for 90 seconds. Every instinct wanted to explain, to say it is not your fault, we will fix it. But making it shorter was exactly wrong. He needed to be all the way inside it. So I sat with my hands on my knees and let him find out. Finally, he said, "I knew about a loan," she said. "It was ours. Our cards, the truck, her medical bills." She showed me a spreadsheet. She sat at the table and I looked at it. He was speaking carefully, the way you carry something cracked. She never said their names, not once. I said, "The judgment against Richard was entered 2 years and 1 month ago. The loan originated 2 weeks later. He put the papers down in his face and his hands, then into his hands, the cleaning business in Grace's name. We gave him $14,000 for that. She called it an investment." He sat up. That was the down payment. I picked up summer school 2 years running. I tutored Saturdays. I proctored state exams for $85 a session. And that is the part that broke me, if you want to know. not the number. The Saturdays, my son had been sitting in a fluorescent room proctoring standardized tests for $85 a session while his savings bled out through a door he did not know was open. I said, I am not telling you what to do. I am telling you what is true because you are entitled to it. He stayed through Sunday. We did not mention Sarah. We hiked a ridge trail Saturday, 5 miles each way. He complained about being out of shape and made fun of me for not being. That night, we built a fire behind the shop and talked past midnight about Margaret, about a camping trip in 2000 when he was 16 that we remembered completely different. When he left, he held on longer than usual. Thank you for telling me. That is what I am for. Then I watched his truck down the road, poured coffee, sat down, and waited. The first thing was a letter. A property management company informing me my unoccupied secondary dwelling might violate county requirements. I looked up the company. Incorporated 11 months earlier, registered agent Grace Hale. Eleanor said, intimidation in a business envelope. No such requirement exists. I said, file it. 4 days later, Daniel called at 6:30, flat voice. She wants me to ask you to add her parents to the deed, partial owners, caretakers when you are away. Daniel, I am here every day. What am I away from? Are you reading that off something? She is in the other room. Tell her the property is not available for transfer, and if that company contacts me again, I file a harassment complaint. Do not soften it. He repeated it. Her voice rose behind him. She says, you are paranoid. And I said, Daniel, that company's registered agent is her mother. Silence. I heard him walk, a door closed. I did not know she had done that. I believe you. She is on the phone with them every day, hours at a time. I did not understand she was organizing something. What do I do? That is the only question that matters, and I will not answer it for you. Whatever you decide, decide it off what is true, not the version you were handed. He got an attorney the next week. 16 days later, he told Sarah he wanted to separate. Her response came in 48 hours, too organized to be spontaneous. I received a certified letter claiming his wife held a financial interest in my property based on contributions her family had made. Eleanor said, so they gave you money? Not $1 has moved between me and that family in either direction, ever. A nuisance filing to cloud title. How is your documentation? Every transaction is in a binder, scanned to 2 drives, bank statements going back to '98. She said, of course, you were an inspector. She had a response in 5 days. The claim was withdrawn in 3. Then Sarah called my cousin Louise and told her I was showing signs of cognitive decline, isolated, hostile, deteriorating. Louise called me directly. I said, I walk 4 miles a day, I cut dovetails by hand, and I filed a legal response to a fraudulent claim last month. Louise laughed and wrote it all down. Eleanor added it to the file. She said, she is throwing everything she can reach. She is not hurting you, Henry. She is building a case against herself, and she does not know it. I sat with that for several days. And here's where I have to be fair, because if I leave this out, I am not telling the whole truth. I thought again about 2019. Sarah driving 3 hours for a man she barely knew at the time because he was hurt and alone. That kindness was real. So I have spent 2 years trying to work out what turns that person into someone who tells a 66-year-old man's cousin he is losing his mind. And the closest I have gotten is this. Some people carry so long they forget how to set anything down. And the weight does not make them stronger. It makes them desperate. The divorce finalized in June. The forensic review found separate accounts that partially offset the losses. Richard's affidavit claiming Daniel promised him $40,000 collapsed in 8 days because Daniel had 4 years of text declining every request. The judge said little. But there is a quality to a judge's silence that everyone in the room understood. Daniel called from his car. I was watching weather come down the valley. He said, lighter, like I set something down I did not know I was carrying. I said, protect that feeling. Then he said, I have been looking at teaching jobs in the valley. I looked at the weather coming down between the ridges. I said, I would like that. He moved to Cedar Bluff in August. Small place on a side street, front porch, a backyard with a fence he immediately overplanned a garden for. He got a position at the county high school teaching American history to juniors who did not know yet how lucky they were to have him. He is out at my place most weekends now, sometimes with a reason and sometimes just because. Teaching himself to cook with great ambition and uneven results, I ate several experimental failures that fall without complaint. Sarah called once in October asking for a statement. I wished her well and said no. I set the phone down and stood in my kitchen for a while. Dutch was under the table. The clock ticked, and I stood there because a person can hold two things at the same time and mean them both completely. I meant the wishing her well. I also meant the no. In November, he brought someone out. She came up the steps, put her hand out, and said her name was Sophie. She restores antique clocks in Abingdon at a shop that has been there since the 1950s. Daniel said he built that cabinet himself. She said, "Can I see it?" 45 minutes in the shop. She asked questions that told me she understood what she was looking at. She was not performing interest. You can always tell. She ran her finger along a dovetail and said, "That is clean." I said, "It has to be." She said, "Yes, it does." That was plenty. We had Thanksgiving at my place. Sophie brought a pie her mother had taught her to make. Her mother came and her brother drove down from Pennsylvania. Daniel carved the turkey badly and with tremendous confidence, and nobody corrected him. And it was the first Thanksgiving in 6 years that felt like the actual thing instead of a scheduled obligation with tension in the room. Sophie's mother and I stood at the kitchen window after dinner looking at the bare oaks against the gray sky, which people find bleak and I do not. Bare hardwoods against winter sky is one of the finer things there is. She said, "It is a beautiful place. How long did it take you to find it?" And I said, "Longer to find it than to know it was right." She said, "That is usually the order. Here is what I have. Everyone thinks the lesson is stand your ground. It is not. When I was young, I thought strength meant carrying anything. 34 years on bridges taught me strength means knowing exactly what something can hold and not allowing 1 pound more. And when I got old, when Margaret was gone and Daniel was in trouble, I learned the thing that matters most. You cannot repair what you refuse to inspect. That was hers. She was right about everything. No is not a wall. It is a diagnostic instrument. I said no to one small request, a building I was not using, and the entire system revealed itself. If I had said yes, I would have been the good father-in-law, and my son would have kept proctoring exams for $85 while his savings drained through a door he did not know was open. I nearly said yes. I came close. So this week, pick one request you would normally absorb, because absorbing is easier than the conversation. Decline it plainly. No reason attached. That does not work for me. Then watch. A healthy relationship absorbs a no without incident. That is the entire test. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who loved you quietly, share it with them. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And tell me which moment hit hardest. Comment 1 if I was right to investigate because there is a real argument it was none of my business. Comment 2 if the moment was the porch, handing him the folder and saying nothing for 90 seconds. Comment 3 if I should have spoken 2 years earlier, the first time I heard the shift in my son's voice, and this is what my silence cost him. I read every one. It is the best part of my week. Tell me where you are watching from. I spent 34 years on structures people crossed without a thought. Someone hearing this at 2 in the morning feels like a bridge I never thought I would build. If you have been the fixer in your family, the one holding everyone up since you were barely grown, I want to hear from you. Not to excuse anything, because there are more of you than anyone says, and I do not think you have been asked how you are doing. Stay with me. There is another one next week. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully reimagined in Cedar Bluff, Virginia to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.